Yay! How's it working? Am I in?
You are.
Awesome. Well, thanks for inviting me. I only caught the first few seconds. Sounds like you were kind of introducing the topic and getting everybody all jazzed up about talking about something that we don't really think too much about, other than it's a pest and it's annoying, or they're useful tools for biocontrol in the garden. But mites have all sorts of allergens. So you got to be careful. I don't know. Did you want to set me up with anything, or do you just want me to ramble on and on? Because I can do it.
Yeah, you and me both. I was actually talking about microbes and bioburden. I didn't even get to that part yet.
Oh, darn.
But,
okay.
But,
Yes.
It might be helpful for people to know a little bit about yourself, Tess. So why don't you introduce yourself a bit and also what Rogue Microbe does?
Awesome. Yeah, my name is Tess Eidem. I have my PhD in microbiology. I spent a good chunk of my research career understanding pathogenic bacteria. So pathogens mean microbes that cause disease. Not all bacteria or molds or other types of microbial life are pathogenic. Most of them are not. But the ones that are can be really, really problematic. So most of my research focused on developing antibiotics and really going after new antibiotics that haven't really been developed yet. So brand new targets, brand new mechanisms of action. Anybody who knows what I'm talking about, thanks. Nerd points to you. And I kind of, I worked as a project manager for Science and Technology Center. My husband and I had a fermented foods company, and I got a little bit of experience in food and building HACCP plans and manufacturing. And I was a professor for a little while and kind of found myself in the cannabis space about 4 years ago. And I got my start in manufacturing, started working boots on the ground, doing all the extraction, processing, purification, distillation, and isolation. So anybody want to nerd out on that, I love that stuff too. I can pretend to be a chemist for a little while, but I'm mostly a microbiologist. So kind of moved over more into consulting to help cultivators and manufacturers understand the root causes of their microbial failures instead of trying to cover up with practices like remediation or recovering failed product. And that's what I've been doing with my company Rogue Micro for the last year or so, and helping folks identify those root causes, helping them kind of get more in line with how other types of herbal products and foods are produced and manufactured. So again, going in preventively and trying to understand where risks are coming in to your process and helping. So I got a doggy that's in the other room that's barking. She's like, play with me. So started working on that. And I also have a research partnership with the University of Colorado at Boulder in their environmental engineering department. So I work trying to understand airborne microbes and their allergens, as well as mites. So sorry, I totally jumped the gun on that one, Matthew, but yeah, so that's what I do. I love to talk to cultivators. Cultivators are super knowledgeable. They know so much more about their plants than I ever will. But one thing I do know is microbes. So I try to bring my knowledge and knowledge of good practices in other parallel industries like food and, herbs and fruits and veggies, and bring that into the cannabis space, especially in these indoor environments that can become very humid and very warm and allow all sorts of things you don't want in your grow.
It sounds a lot like in the military, there's this concept called the survivability onion, especially it's applied to like tanks, but you could really do it for anything. It's like, first step, don't be there. Don't be in the place where they're going to like shoot. Second step, don't be detected, right? Okay, well, you're there, but don't be detected. Oh, okay, you got detected. Well, don't get shot at. Don't get aimed. Okay, they're aiming at you now. Okay, well, don't get shot. Okay, well, now you're shot. Well, don't get damaged. Like, hopefully you are moving in a way, So it's the same kind of thing, I think, with a lot of things in life, trying to find that, what are those layers of defense you can have about whatever the problem is. And like you were saying, like kind of just prevent it before it even becomes a problem. Obviously, that is preferable and ideal, to go through all the other rigmarole when you're doing that. So that makes total sense. And, one thing that you did for me that definitely deserves acknowledgement is like, I sent you this really massive document. Didn't expect you to read the whole thing, of course, but something that is not going to get me, as I joke, it's not going to give me a lot of friends. I'm an avid biocontrol supporter. I want that to be clear before I say anything about this, but this is a report made by the Danish Ministry of the Environment, their Environmental Protection Agency, and it's entitled Health Effects of Predatory Beneficial Mites and Wasps in Greenhouses. And essentially, they talk about a lot of stuff, but one of the things that they mention, I think a lot of people don't realize, is that, and I think Tess could explain better than I could, or more eloquently, was that these things can make you have an allergic reaction even if you had no sensitivity before, or you had maybe a sensitivity but you never knew it. And since you're not walking around, as I heard somebody recently saying, they don't walk around with their immunocompromised meter. Like, you can't just like zap somebody with a little laser and be like, oh, you're immunocompromised, and in this way and to this degree, it doesn't quite work that way. So, even like digging your hands in the soil, I'm not saying people should do this kind of a thing. I find it very therapeutic, but for some people, they do it long enough, or in certain conditions, they can even become sensitized to some of those microbes, and their I want to use a more technical term, but they're associated metabolites and other sorts of stuff, right?
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, these microbes and dust mites and even, peanuts and wheat, and they all have these, what we call antigens. They're usually bits of protein. So protein, if you want to take a big step back and go to the central dogma of all life, has to have DNA as its genetic blueprint. That is then transcribed into RNA, which is then translated into protein. Usually those proteins are the functional things in the cell. They're the little highways that transport materials from one end of the cell to the other. They form the structure of the cell. Sometimes they carry out enzymatic activities, even in cannabinoid synthesis, all of those genes that are making cannabinoids are all proteins, and they carry out these functions. And these proteins, your body can build up. Basically, it can recognize these bits and pieces of these foreign proteins or antigens as a threat, and it can start recognizing them as allergens. So once your body recognizes that as an allergen, it will mount an immune response, and it depends on the type of allergen and how you interact with it. But most of the time, it's going to be like what you expect in an allergic reaction, right? You're going to have a histamine release. You are going to get itchy eyes and runny eyes and nose, maybe sneezing, coughing. But it can even get much worse than that. You can end up having an asthma attack, or if you're really allergic to peanuts, you can go into anaphylactic shock. So some of these bits and pieces of these proteins that aren't necessarily harmful in and of themselves, but because your immune system has built up a response, you can have a really, really bad allergic reaction. And that paper that you shared with me was crazy, because the Danish Ministry of the Environment basically went through all these greenhouse workers and tested them to see if they were sensitized. So would they, in a skin prick test, for example, you put a little bit of that allergen right under the skin, those immune cells that react to those antigens, to those little bits of those proteins, will start releasing. They basically just like dump all of their little contents, which include all these things that recruit in like your immune system cells. They create inflammation, oh man, this dog won't stop barking, and I'm trying to nerd out.
I know what you mean.
Now she's like yipping. She's like, "Arr!"
You want to give her a little bit of attention. I understand. I can tag in
right now. No. So hey Z, you want to see? She's just here on the floor, hanging out, just yipping at me. We're watching her. She's a little bit of a special needs puppy, so I give her some special time when she's eating and stuff. But sorry, I totally digress there. But yeah, so this paper, or this huge report that you sent me, showed that like a quarter of the workers basically developed allergies to different types of mites that they were using, which is just like, that's a pretty high incident of sensitization.
Yeah.
So it shows how immunogenic these little buggers are.
Yeah, and like I've read before. I don't know, maybe like more information has come out since then, or whatever. But like I know that perhaps for a time, maybe it's less true now. Like there's a relationship between I think I told you this, right, Tess? Like instant coffee and cockroach remains.
Oh yeah, I haven't looked that up, but that sounds nuts.
Yeah, and very plausible, But It's one of those things where, and sometimes, and I'm not trying to minimize here, but like everything that Tess said is true, and then also you can have reactions that are sometimes a little bit less noticeable, and that carries with itself its own kind of threat, I think, because rather than being like acute, you might not realize that you're having this sensitization effect because maybe you don't have more of the outward symptoms, and so then things can develop before you even realize it, or you might have other cascading effects that can be very interesting, because essentially, a part of your immune system. When I talk about IPM, like with plants, one of these really interesting trend in plant science has been, or at least in agricultural sectors, is to bioprime the plant immune system. Sometimes just having exposure to a fungus or some other microbe, is there because they share those same, like you say, kind of like antigens essentially for the plant immune system. Even if it doesn't harm the plant, just its presence will prime certain factors to be reacting. And of course, they don't have the white blood cells and the more sophisticated adaptive immune system that mammals do. But it's kind of a similar thing. And so there's ways that we could maybe exploit that if we're a little tactical or strategic in how we do it. On the other hand, though, like with people, that can backfire for certain people. Because they'll have an increased response, or one that maybe is inappropriate, we would say.
Yeah, and mites are nothing new, like in general.
True.
As far as allergen producers, like house dust mites produce dozens of known allergens. So that's actually one of the groups of allergens that I study at CU Boulder. House dust mites are like the number one cause of indoor allergens pretty much across the world. Like you can find papers from every country talking about people with severe house dust mite allergies. And house dust mites, which are like, they're just nuts. They're not so bad here in Colorado because it's pretty dry here. Mm-hmm. But when you get in environments where the humidity is above 50%, which actually the last few weeks here in Colorado it has been, so which is unusual, you get dust mite populations. They live in your bedding, they live in your pillowcases, they live in your mattresses, they live in dust, and they not only eat human skin, like that you've shed, but they also eat their own poop. So they just like eat skin and poop and then poop it back out, and they concentrate these allergens that are in their digestive tract. And these allergens are in their excrement, and their excrement is everywhere in dust. Like it's a huge component of dust. And like people will go in and try to like measure, I've seen so many crazy papers that put like nasal insertions in people's noses while they're sleeping to like filter and measure and grab dust mite allergens that they're breathing in and try to quantify. And then they also quantify what's in their mattresses and in their pillowcases. And dust mites are just like house dust mites are incredibly immunogenic. There's a couple dozen different allergens. I study one called DERP1, which is like, it's like a little protease. So it just goes around and chews up other proteins, but your immune system recognizes it and goes on red alert. And some folks have such bad dust mite allergies that they have to move away into really dry environments and go to like, Arizona or something so that they don't have to breathe that in, because they'll do everything. They'll launder their bedding, they'll vacuum all the time, and it's not enough to control for that. So once you build up that allergy, it's really, really hard to bring it back down. Although there are some experimental therapies where you just like sort of microdose on the allergen to try to bring your tolerance back up. But you just have to be really careful when you do that, especially if you have really severe allergies. So it makes sense that some of these allergens from closely related mite species will have some overlap. They look alike to your immune system. So if you're allergic to house dust mites and know that you have allergies, especially when it's moist out and you're like sleeping in dusty bedding and stuff like that, it's probably going to translate to other mites that you might encounter in a greenhouse setting, including spider mites, which is documented that spider mites have allergens and you can become sensitized to that, and these predatory beneficial mites. So it's pretty crazy. Yeah, and I think somebody asked like where we could find this paper. So if you just Google health effects of predatory beneficial mites and wasps in greenhouses, it came out in 2007 from the Danish Ministry of the Environment. So, and thank you for sharing that with me, Matthew, because that paper was really cool.
I have it up here in case you reference anything, or if you remember anything specific, I can track it potentially. But that's interesting, because mithranditism, or I believe that's what it's called when you expose yourself to a little bit of something so that you become immune. Named after, of course, the king, I believe, that was trying to make themselves, because sic semper tyrannis, poison is usually used to kill tyrants. So you got the cool idea that if I could build up this immunity to maybe some venom or something, and but most of the time that doesn't work. I know a lot of people will think that it works for a lot of things, and it works for some things, but not really for a lot of things. If it's a little bit harmful, it's going to continue to be a little bit harmful for you, wouldn't you say? Or especially in your field, right?
It seems like once you develop allergies, it's hard to back out of that. Your immune system is primed. Basically, you literally have locked in new DNA splicing that now recognizes that little antigen. It's crazy how immune cells, they'll actually alter their DNA so that they'll make a very specific antibody. So B cells do this, T cells do this too. They'll make a very specific antibody or a receptor that will recognize a little epitope, which is just a little bit of that antigen. It's just like usually like a 7 amino acid sequence. And it'll recognize that. And once it recognizes that, you have those basically those B cells that now have become residents in your body. They are constantly producing a little bit of this antibody, and if there's some cross-reactivity, if that little antibody sees something, I always do this when I say antibody because they're shaped like a Y.
This, right? They come together.
Antibody.
You're reminding me all of these diagrams and things are flooding into my memory. Actually, before prepping to talk a little bit more about plant immune response, I actually took some time to go back to, I think it was like might not have been Cornell, but there was a university who was just like, hey, here's our immunology course, like just for free up here. Berkeley, it was Berkeley, of course. I think they do that for a lot of things. And I was like, why don't I just refresh my memory? And yeah, like the immunosomes and lysosomes, those things that are produced just to go right through everything and just destroy it. but they start at these
they just release, like, they're like, oh, there's something I don't like, and they're like, poop out a bunch of reactive oxygen species.
Yeah,
and
just
like,
kill
it's crazy.
everything. Yeah, it really is more
like,
destructive. You'd think it was more delicate, but it can't be. It's explosions of proteins going on. But so I have a question though, or is there a part when you were looking over it that you thought would be really interesting? Actually, we could just go that way, I suppose.
To chat about, I think. So this is something that we think about a lot in the cannabis space. I've seen spider mites. Almost everyone who's worked in cultivation have seen spider mites at some point in time. And a lot of times you think, oh, it's just a pest and it's annoying and it's kind of gross, but whatever. We'll clip off the parts and brush off the little webs. And
sure. Yeah,
fine.
Exactly.
But that's one thing, that and even beneficial. I think it's really important to, understand why they're there to begin with, and really understand that they could be a liability on your final product. In that, if not only on your final product, but for your workers who are exposed to this and who are breathing this in, especially when the mites are in full swing, because it's not only their bodies and their exoskeletons and when they shed their I'm not an entomologist, so when they shed and then they also poop, all of that can be allergenic, and it's not like it just disappears after dry cure. That some of that could remain, and your workers are breathing that in. And with what the Danish Ministry of the Environment has shown, with a quarter of workers who interact with these predatory mice become sensitized to it. Not all of them, sensitization means that basically that you have antibodies towards it. Not all of that will manifest as incredible allergies, but in this paper, some of them did. Mm-hmm. And so you have to be really cognizant as a manufacturer. If you are working with these, that could be a risk to your people. And just understanding that is a risk, and maybe there's some, some preventative controls. I actually haven't thought too much about this, but what could you do as a manufacturer to minimize the exposure? Maybe when you are putting out those a mask. Maybe right. you have a mask when you're working with in an area that has different types of mite populations, or when you are administering the beneficials. And then on final product to your work or to your consumers, it's been pretty well established that combustion of plant matter, both in tobacco and cannabis, does not kill microbes, and it doesn't destroy these different bits and pieces of immunogenic, mites and their poop and molds and their allergens. It doesn't necessarily destroy them, and so you could be inhaling those when you are breathing that in, when you're, smoking a joint. And so how can you minimize these risks? And really, if you have, again, this goes back to what I preach about all the time on the micro side, if you have spider mite issues, or if you need to use predatory beneficials, then you probably should try to understand the root cause of why this is happening, bump up your IPM measures, which Matthew's an expert at, so he could definitely talk about all the things you can do to prevent this in the first place, so you are minimizing those risks, not only for your workers, but to your consumers as well. And I think that I've seen papers too on spider mites and allergens that have been developed, and it's almost all ag workers, agricultural workers. They interact with these mites all the time, and they build up, an immune response. And
a lot of farmers are older too. That's another thing, and they've been doing it for a long time. So you can expect it to be cumulative. I think the median age of a farmer, last time I checked, which is now that I think about it, a few years ago, was mid-60s or something. Or early 60s, exactly. So, and that was in the U.S. So other parts of the world, assuredly there's different age ranges and everything, but yeah, exactly. And I'll tell you what, when I was, the various non-cannabis grow, at this point I probably have a little bit more experience in cannabis and other crops that I've worked with, but I was in China, people weren't like applying, biocontrols with like a mask and gloves. You know what I'm trying to say? They weren't getting into the Tyvek suit because, and if they could get out of even wearing PPE when they were spraying other compounds, even things that are, generally safe, but you should still wear because there's the concentration that you're exposed to. Like, they would try to get out of that too if it wasn't for how terrible the laws would be in a place like California, for example. But like, yeah, a lot of people don't take it seriously too because they don't see it, right? It's an invisible threat. It's, you know what I mean?
Well, and it takes time, like you said, to build up some of these allergies. You don't always like get an allergy right away. It takes time.
Yeah.
Even like folks who develop cannabis allergies, I had one of my workers when I was working in New York in manufacturing, she was allergic to cannabis and to a particular strain. It was like one strain always got her, like, she'd rash out, and she had to wear a full respirator when she was grinding. It happens over time. And I think, and it's been shown in other, parallel industries, that if you have a lot of other allergens that are present, so if you have a lot of mold allergens, if you have a lot of dust mite allergens, it can actually kind of cross-react. So your body sees these mold and these other allergens, and then they'll also see cannabis antigens and be like, that's a target too. And so it can actually sensitize you to something you might not normally be sensitized to because you've got these other allergens.
I'm sure that, do you know, like, why it almost feels like when somebody has like a bad reaction to a food, like food poisoning, and then you like can't eat that. Sometimes people just swear off a food, and it's very, very powerful. Other times it's less so, and they can try it again. But it's very fascinating how that kind of thing can happen. It's very unintuitive. It makes sense when you say it, but like you wouldn't maybe think necessarily, like if you were trying to pick out, like if you were a legislator and you were trying to do your due diligence and being like, well, whatever, like certain things can smokescreen other more fundamental effects.
Yeah, like, in cannabis space, we focus a lot on, chemical hazards like pesticides, some biological hazards, but it's almost always microorganisms that are alive, or at least their DNA is intact, specific microorganisms. But we don't talk much about these other bits and pieces of these microbes, or other bits and pieces of mites and they even in this Danish Ministry of the Environment also talked about beneficial wasps and how they might be a source of allergens too. And so it's just important to know that just because you can't see something doesn't mean that it's not a risk. And you really have to protect your workers because some people, and it does seem that some folks who have really bad allergies will be prone to developing other allergies as well. It's like their immune system's in overdrive. And so if you're allergic to dust mites, you're usually allergic to molds, you're usually allergic to pollen, you're usually allergic to like a whole slew of different allergens. But in these ag settings, you see very specific allergies develop against what they're interacting with at high concentrations over long periods of time. So spider mites, these beneficial mold allergens, they've all been linked to animal husbandry and ag work. So that's why, like I'm from Nebraska, and grain silos and other ag areas, it's been known, like farmer's lawn, that's been known for a very long time, that these microbes that are in these ag settings will over time contribute to all sorts of pulmonary issues, not only because of the allergens, but also because of other antigens that are produced, like lipopolysaccharide, LPS, which is endotoxin. That's just part of the bacterial cell wall, and and like that can trigger. That's like a classic trigger of the immune system. You don't need antibodies towards that. Your innate immune system has evolved to recognize that. And so you say that again.
Oh, I was gonna say plants too, like because they only have the innate and similar sorts of things.
Plants.
Yeah.
I love my planties, but I don't know that much about their immune system. I do know they do a lot with siRNAs to like degrade they go after the DNA and RNA of pathogens. And
that stuff is more,
because they don't,
that's more sophisticated stuff, true, that people have been having more and more appreciation for. It's pretty fascinating at that very molecular level. I know that, I'm not a plant immunologist, but I know they have like the NLR receptors. There's a lot of, it's very well. I mean, I think just by knowing the innate immune system in animal, it is different, of course, but like it's very similar, and that's why we use the same words, right? So there's a lot of the same kind of stuff. I often say that they don't have white blood cells like we do, but they do have like a microbiome like we do. But then they kind of outsource it. They kind of outsource it a little bit. And sometimes they have stuff that travels with them from parent to offspring, and I guess that's about as close as it gets. But that's why plants have to rely so much. It's almost like each plant cell kind of does double duty in a way. So.
Yeah, I mean, as vertebrates, we have a pretty awesome immune system. That doesn't mean we don't. I mean, until antibiotics came around in modern sanitation, treating wastewater, not drinking the water that you poop in, infections were the leading cause of death for humanity since we, started walking on 2 feet. So and even in some developing countries, you'll see that diarrheal diseases are like #1 causes of death. That's virus and bacteria and other types of microbes. So, we're not above it. We've had a lot of help with modern medicine, but these allergens, this is also I don't know if you've ever heard of the clean world hypothesis or what else is it? Oh, the hygiene hypothesis, that we're almost so clean that our immune systems now are recognizing things that aren't threats. Wow, and so sometimes they'll infect people with little non-replicating nematodes to get their immune system to attack a parasite because their body's never seen a parasite before. It's like my dogs get worms, they go out and eat raccoon poop, so you gotta deworm them. But humans, we don't really see that as much anymore. So sometimes it can, the hypothesis, this is not super well established or anything, is that because we have such a hygienic environment, our immune system sort of develops these reactions to things that aren't actually harmful to us. But, that is part of our immune system too. It's to recognize something that is not self and to attack it. And that's what it does, whether it's a mold allergen or a dust mite or beneficial. And so I think that it's really important to think about that very holistically when you're trying to create a fairly clean environment that you're growing something in, especially for medical patients and people who might be hypersensitized to some of these allergens, because they aerosolize and you breathe them in, so you want to really be careful with that.
So does this mean that people should never grow organically? Is that what you're saying?
Oh my goodness, no.
I know, right? But the amount of people who hear this and then go, oh, I understand, I see, you just want all the control, and that people have to all grow in sterile, substrates in a room that costs, the GDP of a small country somewhere else in the world, no, it's not about that. It's just recognizing, and some people will never have these effects, right? That's the whole point that I'm trying to make, I think, is my major takeaway from this report and your work and the kinds of things that people like yourself do, is some people will have these reactions. Some people will. Some people won't. And some people have it on a spectrum. And you don't know you will have this effect or not. So far as I could tell, I haven't. And maybe this will be different. Sometimes people develop, I'm sure you're very familiar, people develop lactose intolerance as they age, right? Things like this. So, and there's like
That's
there's
why you just keep
environmental
drinking milk. That's why I drink a gallon of milk a week. That way I never build up
Isn't that
an intolerance.
sensitization though?
Well, so lactose intolerance is you don't produce lactase, the enzyme that breaks it down.
Right.
Although there are milk and dairy allergies, so that's different than being
That's
lactose
true. That's
intolerant,
true.
I think.
I guess, and some people can change. Like it's an environmental. I just want to say there's a genetic factor,
yes,
majorly, and then there's other factors. Some people in the comments were mentioning like, if you change your diet, that can have a profound effect on certain allergens, right? And you can even like kind of eliminate your symptoms. I don't think you eliminate being allergic though, although maybe it depends on the allergy.
Well, and your diet is also incredibly affected by your microbiome. Like, it's not just the food you're eating, but the microbes in your gut that are eating the food that you're eating and pooping out other metabolites. Yeah. And the microbes in your gut, I mean, I'm a big believer in fermented foods. I'm drinking kombucha right now, but I also love sauerkraut, kimchi. Give me that funky stuff. It's good for you. It's good for your gut.
Stuff, though. It's got to be the good stuff.
It can't just be
like pickles and fermented stuff. There's fermented, and then there's like, we brined it in vinegar.
True. There's like quick pickling,
it's not the same thing.
Vinegar and salt. Yeah, that's not the same thing. You got to get some microbes in there. Yeah. You got to let them, take like 5 to 10 days to do their magic. And those, especially lactic acid bacteria, they're really good for your gut. And there's other microbes out there. We're uncovering more and more about the beneficial microorganisms and everything that they do. There was a paper that just came out, and it blew my mind. I need to find it before I start talking about it, because I read it once, like late at night while I was like scrolling. I was like,
I know
what?
the feeling.
But it was showing that certain microorganisms, I think it was Parkinson's disease, they've known for a while, just looking at fecal microbiomes, and microbiome just means all the different microbes that are present within a fecal sample, that they've seen this association with a specific microbe with people who have Parkinson's. And over the last probably 15 years, they've been diving deeper into what is that? Is it just an association? Is it causal? Is it linked to the disease? Or is it, a result of having the disease? It's always really hard to parse these things out. But they found that this microbe actually releases this protein into the gut, which is taken up into the blood vessels, transfers into the brain, and actually can facilitate adducts forming. So adducts are like little congregates of protein, and that's what you see in a lot of these diseases, is you see these proteins aggregating and forming these insoluble proteins that can basically mess up brain cells and other neurons and stuff like that. And so they showed that it's basically one of the potential causes. It's like, what the hell? This is crazy. But we've seen that. I mean, we know that for different cancers, viruses are involved. Like, it's not unusual, but again, it's that whole thing. You don't see microbes and their bits and pieces and other things, and so you don't really recognize the role that they can play, both beneficial and harmful potentially. And sometimes it takes a long time for these microbes and other allergens, other small things like allergens, to really have an effect. And so I think that is super fascinating. And the more we dive into this microverse of little tiny things, I think the more we understand how they contribute to these larger things, like an organism like a human or a plant.
I haven't read research. Yeah, I mean, and like I always talk about, I'll say this part first. This is probably more interesting. I read a research report that showed, and I think this was like an immunocompromised person, I think too, plus somebody who had cancer. So like, again, very small, very unique environment. I'm going to say ecosystem, because what they found was that in some of these cancer cells, some of these metastasized tumors, essentially, some microbes were able to infect them because the nature of them being cancer cells, they weren't really good at regulating themselves, and I guess so they made actually and then they also made really good shelter for some organisms that. So it's like a foothold. Again, probably didn't help that the entire host was sort of immunocompromised, having other stuff going on, but just an interesting point. Unfortunately, I came across the report because somebody was trying to argue something a little bit more ridiculous, which was that the microbes are causing the cancer. When the paper didn't say that, they were just like, "See, it's what I thought all along," even though the researchers didn't say anything about it.
I read 2 sentences of the abstract. Now I know everything about the science.
I already had a preconceived notion about what that microbe actually caused the problem, and so now that's the evidence now. But the other thing is that people, I feel like they don't get they don't have a really good appreciation for. I kind of lost my train of thought actually, but it was supposed to be related to.
I derailed you.
Something you were saying. What was the last thing you were saying?
We were talking about we were talking about the microbiome in your gut and how that affects other parts of your body. It affects your metabolism, affects your
insects often. Like people, the other thing is that I come across a lot. People say that, hey, insects have white blood cells too. Or at least at the very least they have analogous tissues.
Yeah, like innate immunities.
Well, no, there's some like white blood cell-esque thing. I know that there's they're fat. I think they're cells like fat bodies. I think they're called, and those can do some of the immune. There's some immune effects or some response to like infection, wounding, and that kind of stuff. But it's different when you don't have a circulatory system like a mammal. You know what I mean? So it's a little. Yeah, I mean you're kind of screwed up. Like if things have penetrated through the shell, it's kind of like everything's exposed.
Yeah, that's my defense. That's it.
Yeah, that's kind of the big part of it. Yeah. So, but I guess it's really cool to see research. I think people just don't appreciate how adaptive a lot of these insects are and how much and this is where it relates to what you were saying, they rely on these microbes. Aphids rely on them a lot, ants rely on them a lot, termites couldn't eat wood without the xylases that they produce that break down xylem wood. So I mean certainly it's true for so many insects, but like for the ones that we're concerned about in agriculture that eat the plants when they're still alive, that's like that is a massive effect, and it goes down really far. Like I'm doing a video on aphids right now, and it's interesting to consider how one population of a species can have a radically different microbiome that will allow it to, for example, people know biocontrols, or like wasp biocontrols that might use for aphids. Well, sometimes there's a pea aphid that has a bacterial symbiote that helps it do some other stuff, like create some amino acids and things that it wouldn't be able to do otherwise. And then, or defend against some things. It's Hamiltonella defensa. And then some, not all, but some strains of Hamiltonella defensa have a symbiont of that symbiont, a virus, a bacteriophage. Now, bacteriophages, of course, normally infect bacteria and kill them, or harm them. Maybe they're not always successful, but it's usually what happens. And in this case, it infects the bacteria, but it actually gives it some enzymes that are damaging to larval parasitic wasps when they're developing in the aphid. And so they release these toxins, essentially. I think they're cell toxins that I guess are very much unique for this wasp, or maybe that lineage of insects, because it didn't kill the aphid. And so that kind of stuff is fascinating. That like people don't give insects enough credit. I think that they think that they're like, some people like they're lower beings or something, that you're going to be vulnerable. But like aphids are insects that learn how to be bacteria, as far as I'm concerned. They asexually reproduce for the most part. They're practically born pregnant already. Their big claim to fame that lets them adapt is that they basically make clones of themselves, like a lot of microbes do, a lot of single cellular microbes, right? So, I think that's another thing. Like, there's this arms war, this very precise arms war that's going on between herbivorous insects and plants, and not all plants are going to react the same, not all people are going to react the same to sensitizers, and it's true for a lot of other interactions as well. It's more complicated. It's more complicated than people think.
It's always complicated. And I think that it's really important to bring that up because these, people, a lot of times when we think about evolution, we're like, survival of the fittest. And I always say that when I'm like running past someone and I'm like, leave them behind. But that's actually not how evolution really happens. It happens, like you said, in these ecosystems. So how cooperation and maybe a little bit of backstabbiness can get you an advantage, but it's not just like I'm the strongest, I'm going to survive. It's I know how to work with this species and get something from them, and they will give me something in return, or we'll exchange something, and because of that, we can both survive. And that's typically how you see a lot of these evolutionary relationships evolve. And as far as microbes go in your gut, we are limited to only the genes that we have in our body. You were talking about termites and how they utilize, these big, these enzymes that are produced by the microorganisms. We do that too in our gut. There's all sorts, if we don't have the genes, we'll just bring in some microbes that have those genes and can break down certain complex carbohydrates that we can't break down. And then they make other things that we need, serotonin. And there's a lot of microbe-produced metabolites that are known to be good, but then there's always a little bit of backstabby that could be going on too. And some of those microbes may not always be good all the time. And we see that a lot with Pseudomonas aeruginosa, where it's mostly a plant pathogen. And you might know a little bit more about this than I do from an IPM standpoint, but there was a paper that came out not that long ago that showed different basically strains of Pseudomonas aeruginosa with different, and I think they had different phages, laying dormant or latent.
Yeah, they could have different forms too, so it's even more complicated because
it's so complicated. And then they have mobile genetic elements, so they can exchange. They're you and me, we can only give our genes to our kids. But bacteria, they can give genes to each other. They can even give genes to other species. So I can give a gene to my dog and be like, oh, you can't digest milk? Well, now you can. Because I just gave you the gene that allows you to do that. So they can do that kind of thing. And some Pseudomonas aeruginosa strains seem like they can be slightly beneficial in certain circumstances, but most of the time they're not. And so it's a very complex relationship, and I think that that's really important, that it's not always cut and dry, and that as a scientist and as a cultivator and as a consumer, it's good to recognize that things are always probably more complex than they seem, but not to jump the gun on any one thing, but understand where true risks are to your plants, to your people, and to your product. I brought it back. And I circled it back.
That's well done. No, you really did, and that's better than me sometimes. But I will say, let me ask you this. Well, first of all, I want to say for anyone, actually, the viewership went up. Actually, as we were going through, so that's nice. I appreciate it.
Yeah,
we haven't really been answering any questions or anything in the comments.
Oh yeah, sorry, I've just been going on.
A lot of friends in the comments that I really appreciate. Good points, like my buddy Russell. We've actually had lots of conversations, very stimulating ones about microbiome and his experience with dietary shift changing his allergic response. He didn't get I don't remember what the allergies are actually, unfortunately, but he had that experience, for example. And I love talking about how especially mobile genetic elements and it's very much a cheat code.
That shit.
It's very much a genetic cheat code, and it's interesting to look at it that way. Sometimes that simplification might lend to some misleading conclusions to be drawn, but at the same time there's some interesting capabilities as well. With regard to cannabis, though, since we're on the topic, and it was something I promised I would talk about a little bit, but what do you think? What would be some things? So I think I'll probably stay for that. I think we'll wrap up in about 10 or 15 minutes.
Okay.
So I'm curious, for the people who are still here, what might be some things that you think people could really take away, especially since you have that great presentation on your Rogue Micro YouTube channel, which I took a look at and I found it really helpful. But what do you think knowing that's complicated, and knowing that a lot of people maybe unfortunately interpret this as like, oh, you're saying no to regenerative ag, or you're saying no to organic, or you're saying no to growing like in a traditional sense. For people who want to continue to do that as much as possible, because it's important to them from a quality standpoint, but also perhaps even in other ways that are respectable, like they just want to grow a certain way and that's respectable.
Yeah.
What do you think they could do to sort of like appreciate both of those facts?
Yeah, well, I mean, not all microbes are bad, and that's number one. Most microbes are not bad for you, especially in your diet when you're talking about fermented foods and stuff like that, which we've been talking about a little bit. But, I think that there's been some studies done, especially on plant pathogens. And when you have a diverse microbiome, because you're growing organically and you have other types of microbes there, they act as competition and they fight off some of those plant pathogens. And so it's not necessarily a bad thing to have diversity. In fact, it's good to have diversity because you can limit some of these monocultures and problematic microbes once they get a hold in your garden. So, I mean, I think that really it's a matter of what is the product quality that you want to shoot for. And if you are failing for different microbes, understanding what you're failing for so you can trace it back and find it in, maybe your organic soil, maybe it has pathogenic E. coli in there that you don't want. Not all E. coli cause disease.
True.
You don't, not all of them are gonna give you the runs, but some of them do. And so like, if you are trying to trace back where you're having problems, like in your compliance testing, it's good to really vet where you're getting this. Make sure that if you are using compost, that you're following all the USDA rules about composting. You're giving it enough time, it's getting to the right temperature. You're basically competing out those bad microbes that potentially could be in there. And again, just knowing your microbes, getting a lay of the land, your microbial landscape. What is that little ecosystem that you're creating? Is it your organic components, or is it the fact that you never let outside air in or don't filter your air and now you've got mold problems? In my experience, most people's micro issues come from environmental controls not being in place and sanitation controls not being in place. So it gets too warm and too humid, and there's not proper cleaning done pretty much every day. Like my husband's a brewer. Well, he was a brewer here in Colorado. And when he first got his job, everyone's like, oh, it's awesome. You can drink for free in the tap room. You get a case of beer a week. This is amazing. How do you love brewing? And he's like, I mean, I love it, but you're 95% of your time, you're a janitor. Like you're cleaning.
Yeah.
You have to clean. You have to clean. And so just because you're using organic components doesn't mean that you shouldn't be cleaning pretty rigorously, that, and making sure that you're not accidentally cross-contaminating an infected batch. You're just using good practices as far as, if I were to, when you're pruning and topping and stuff, you want to make sure you're cleaning those shears so you're not transferring any diseases over. If you ever go to a hospital and need like a toe removed or a limb removed, you're not going to use the same like freaking tools that you did on 10 other people. So like just really basic sanitation, and then just making sure you've got good air circulation, that it's not getting too warm, it's not getting too humid. And, last, if you can develop a little quality department, like what they have, even in the smallest microbreweries, they have a microscope, they have auger plates, they use an ATP meter to swab surfaces to make sure that they're clean before it touches any product, or, just doing some validation, making sure that you are getting eyes on your microbes. And I think that's way more important. You can definitely get source materials that have contaminants in them too. So vetting your vendors and maybe sending out raw materials to make sure that they are good, or at least those microbes that are in those raw materials aren't making their way over to your final product and potentially causing compliance failures. So that's my advice. I don't think cannabis needs to be grown in a sterile environment, like a clean room level pharma, but I do think that it needs to be grown in at least like a brewery level hygiene. Like you're cleaning, even like, and breweries have less, they have to maintain fewer quality and product safety standards than like food manufacturing does. So that's even a little less of a craziness than if you were making like prepackaged foods or burritos or even dog food.
Yeah.
So, you know, just getting good practices in place. Look to other indoor agriculture. There's other, like SQF has some standards out there for indoor. Most of it is prevention by cleaning and making sure that your environmental controls are taken care of. Your HVAC can handle the amount of air that you are circulating through each room every hour, and you're getting that good air filtration and stuff like that. So I just went on for a while, but there's a lot you can do that doesn't involve nuking everything all the time.
Yeah.
Like, you can embrace these beneficials but understanding them, not just being like, I've done this for 20 years and blah, blah, blah. It's like, well, show me some data. Show me some data for yourself. It's good to have data.
Yeah. And I think that's where, like some people were saying in the comments about, obviously there's a huge difference in, what you have to do with regards to between like a grow situation and a commercial grow situation. But it's like, in a way that kind of doesn't matter because, we're still so if you don't acknowledge that's complex, suddenly you're just, what is it like tag? You can't get me. Like, is it like a childhood game where you can just be like, oh well, no. See, you only really get contaminants that will harm you in a commercial setting. You're never going to get in a home grow setting because they're not looking for it. Like, that's not quite how reality works. But it can mean that you're less likely, for reasons to do with that are obviously associated with the rigmarole of scale and so obviously I think that's what most people mean when people say that, and I think that's totally valid. But on the other hand, you could expose yourself to something or other people. Like, on the one hand, I think that if you have like a home grower that you rely on, or if you rely on yourself, like I tell people all the time, like, I've worked with many friends who grow on their own, and I've worked with people who are not like friends but acquaintances, or we have like a community grow or something, and there's no guarantee that a home grower doesn't know that malathion shouldn't be applied to their product, to their plants, or some other, nefarious chemical, for example, let alone some microbe that maybe because they didn't know that their manure was super hot, or you know what I mean? Like, people can make mistakes. Like, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter if it's commercial or not. And I've certainly experienced it. And insidiously, you might not be able to tell, like, the first few times that you were even exposed to something that could be a problem. And maybe there's a difference between being exposed to it when you're 21 and being exposed to it when you're 31 or 41 or 61 also. So, there's all of these different points, and I again, like, I think a lot of people I know are totally fine growing home grow, and as far as I know, they're not spraying like ivermectin or like a bunch of stuff that like or getting like sort of lung diseases or things like that. But it's like when I'm very supportive of like biorational pesticides or applications rather. So things that are like they have like a lot of times they have like sublethal effects on pests or things like that, or the way that they work is by kind of like shoring up a defense rather than being like a weapon. They're more like something that will prime the immune system, or it like has some sort of other like physiological trigger that when used in combination with other things, you get something that's greater than some of their parts. And
Right.
I like that kind of stuff. And a lot of times it's microbe based, and it might be microbes that have been destroyed or killed. It's their metabolites that you're using to trigger this effect, or it's the microbe application itself. But just because you applied something, it's like, are you even testing to see what is in your soil?
Yeah,
Oh, it's biodiverse.
Yeah.
Source, where's your source? Sources, I saw it in a dream. Like, because you feel like it's biodiverse because you applied all this stuff. Like,
right.
Yeah, it's like you have to make that. Like, I know people who have like they've steam sterilized their soil. I've had this one particular example where somebody steam distilled their soil, but they thought all the microbes that they had applied earlier would still be in it, and I'm like, probably not, not, right? Yeah. So like sometimes we just forget something, and like maybe if they had like written it all out and been like, oh shoot, like I think that the steam distillation killed all the microbes. Sometimes people don't know that, or they might think some will survive and maybe some do and others don't, or maybe they're out in the soil, but you can't really control that. And so I always ask for quantification, when you can. And luckily that kind of stuff is becoming easier and easier for people to do for their own benefit. It can only help yourself. Again, I'm not like saying that all people's home grows has to be like you were saying, like some clean room grow. That's not at all necessary, I don't think. But I think it would be really great. It would up your game to know, like, hey, I can take this test. These cool like mini PCR systems and nanopore, and other systems out there are becoming democratized, and people who aren't like a big research firm can have this limited but has an effect of being able to record some things genetically, and I think that's awesome. And I think that more and more people are able to do it. That's always better.
Absolutely. I think it's all about, it's every grower I know, they love data. Like, they really do love having data. They, they know how much CO2 ppm is in each room, how much it fluctuates, how much light they're getting. Like, so it makes sense too to want to monitor and control other potential risk factors or beneficials like microbes and other, arthropods that are being used in the garden. And I agree with you too, as you scale, your problems scale too. And that's normally what I've seen. And I grew 4 plants in my backyard last year, and I dried them in my garage and then cured them in glass jars with 58% Bovida pack. And I use this anecdotally all the time as it was really easy for me to do that because I only have 4 plants. And then I tested in my kitchen. I had auger plates, I have pipettes, I have sterile PBS or phosphate buffered saline, which is what I do all my dilutions in. And I only had 1,500 CFU or colony forming units of total yeast and mold per gram, which is pretty low. In Colorado, the limit is 10,000. In Michigan, for rec, it's 100,000. So it was really low, and it's because I only had 4 plants to take care of. It's dry here. They're baking in the sun. I had a couple of, I think it's doable. It's definitely doable. And honestly, I think on a smaller scale, it's easier to control those issues. But when you scale and you have a whole sea of green and you go in and it's thousands of square feet in one room, and they're all sharing the same room, and they're all sharing the same air, and they're all sharing the same nuke tank water, if one little thing goes wrong, and they're all from the same mom, so they're all genetically identical, you're gonna have fucking problems. And that's really what if you're gonna scale, make sure you have diversity in there, make sure that you, and we've talked about this too, Matthew, maybe there always seems to be a strain specific micro issue. Cull those strains that just can't handle it, and maybe breed for more resistant strains like we do it in other industries. So, and you'd know more about this than me, but I think that there's just a lot that we could do instead of blaming testing, instead of blaming regulations, instead of saying, oh, microbes aren't all bad, which is true.
Yeah.
But you still don't want to be inhaling spoiled product or product from a plant that was infected and you just cut around some of the bad spots. Like, no. So that's my like 2 cents. But it's definitely doable. People do it. You can, and when you scale, just start collecting data, and not just any data. Be strategic. Spend your money on stuff that's important. Make sure all your raw materials are pretty clean. If not, maybe you do need to do something to clean them if they have bad stuff in them that you don't want in there. I've seen all sorts of shit in cocoa. So like that's just one example. So yeah, that's like, I think that there's no one answer, but there is a lot that you can gain as a grower by just taking the reins and collecting some data. Get a tiny little micro lab up and running and do basic stuff like plating. PCR is also something that is getting easier and easier to incorporate. And I know some of the bigger companies, bigger MSOs are starting to do PCR in-house, but it's, to me, that's a little bit above and beyond what you need to do.
Yeah.
Just get an idea of what microbes are coming in, what you're failing for, and where they're coming from. So anyway, I've probably kicking that dead horse enough, but yeah, not all microbes are bad, but it's more than just the microbes. It's their bits and pieces, and they can infect you directly, some of them, but I'm actually more concerned about spoiled or infected plants and breathing that stuff in, because that is more chronic over time. So, and like we said, we don't always, humans are really bad at like seeing that over a long period of time.
Yes,
they only recognize immediate patterns.
That's the ultimate concession, for sure. That's absolutely, we're bad at that. We're as the philosopher of the mind, Daniel Dennett, has often said in presentations, like, the mind is an intellectual miser. Unless that was a misquote, in which case I'm actually making my point. But the point is that like your brain is, so it's wired. It doesn't take a genius to realize. I was just having this conversation with somebody. It doesn't take a genius to realize this, that like you're not immune to propaganda, or you're not immune to like statistics. You have trouble with big numbers. We have trouble with correlations sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
It can be very difficult, that's what makes like phasing behaviors easier in some cases, because you can just replace certain stimuli or whatever for certain things. But regardless of all that, it's like, you have to come at it like, maybe I am wrong. I could be wrong about something. There's one thing to be confident, but you should also be like, well, but maybe I might be wrong, and why don't I check to make sure? And I don't think that should be a controversial concept. I think
you
people
should always always question. Like, there's like this when I went to grad school, the first thing you learn is to never trust yourself.
Yeah, it takes
like
discipline.
You're just like, I have this data, but I don't trust it until I replicate it 5 more times, and then I might trust it. We'll see how it goes. But that's how it is, and like, you've got to recognize what is this? I don't know who said this or if I made it up, but keep an open mind, but not so open your brain falls out. Like,
have a filter. Have a filter.
Yeah.
And sometimes we learn that the wires that make up that filter might even be wrong, and maybe we have to replace it with a different filter. That does happen too. So be even open to replacing the filter. But yeah, I think that's a good way to do the metaphor. But I think I should go at this point. I did say a little bit longer, but it was for good reason, and I think you made a really good point. So I'm just going to say, for those who haven't, you should check out Tess's presentation on YouTube. It is Rogue Microbe LLC on YouTube, is it not? Or just Rogue Micro?
Rogue Micro LLC, yep.
Yeah. And micro or microbe?
Micro.
Micro, yeah. I've been saying it wrong. So it's Rogue Micro.
That's okay.
By itself, which sounds
out there.
Which is a lot more succinct, so I like that better. On YouTube, and it's a good presentation about more than what we just talked about. This is kind of a nice conversational, talking about many things related to like bioburden and microbes on flower, and like what's a threat, what's not a threat. And I think that and the impetus for this was, a big part of it was that I wanted to have a presentation with Tess about this subject, because it's something I think is often misconstrued. And honestly, I get it. It's very frustrating, and it's really frustrating when people don't even take people being like people in charge of like commercial spaces and like what you can and cannot do, regulators, that's the word for it. You know, those people, maybe they don't have a adroit understanding themselves, or they're relying on advisement that maybe is partial or has other problems associated with it. So you have to be an informed citizen, you have to be an informed customer and consumer, and if you're part of the community, you should be informed about those things that affect you, I think, and then you can render your own opinion. So yeah, so thanks, Tess, for being here, and I'm sure we'll do more presentations and live streams like this. So if you liked this and you're here at the end, let us know some other topics you might like us to talk about related to microbes, and yeah, we can talk about that. So let me know, and I'll talk to you guys later.
Thank you, Matthew. Thanks, everybody. Bye.